Thank you so much for joining me today in my translation speech. I'd like to talk to you about an article by Martin Remland, who is a scholar and who wrote about organizational leaders and nonverbal communication training. More importantly, what I'd like to talk to you about is the Christian perspective of organizational leaders and their need to be trained in the nonverbal area. We will look at the article summary, essentially what Remland was talking about. Then we will look into the Christian perspective of this summary. I would like to first open by asking those of you who have worked for an organization before, who's had a boss that seemed far superior or acted far superior than anyone else. And maybe you were even called to a meeting or you asked for a meeting with this boss and you prepared diligently for and were on time for, only to find out that this boss was late and never paid particular attention to what you were saying. In other words, not listening to what you were saying, but really exerted what their agenda was. And in the end, you walked out of there feeling like there was nothing accomplished. You felt inferior to that person. And ultimately, you didn't even want to come back and talk to that person again. Well, that is essentially what Remland is talking about. That there is a need for training of organizational leaders in the nonverbal communications area, paying close attention to the face-to-face exchange within a superior and a subordinate. He explains the various nonverbal communication that are present around these exchanges. For example, kinesics, which relates to the body language of a superior and a subordinate during a face-to-face exchange, where the boss or the superior is more relaxed, whereas the subordinate is more tensed. He also talked about proxemics, which relates to the space between the superior and the subordinate. An example would be a desk in front of a superior, their own office, whereas the subordinate has maybe a cubicle or just a small desk. Then he delves into the temporal, or recently, or more accurately, the chronemics, which relates to time, and how, in my example, I talked about the subordinate being on time, whereas the superior being late. These are all nonverbal communication messages that are around an organization between a superior and a subordinate. Then Remland goes into suggesting that we really need to pay particular attention to, and we, meaning the organizations, need to pay particular attention to these nonverbal communication messages and adjust them accordingly so that the disparity between a superior and a subordinate diminishes and can therefore create a more productive and effective organization. I'd like to quote Remland when he defines considerate behavior as behavior that communicates high esteem or regard for subordinates by reducing the status discrepancy they perceive between themselves and their superior. Essentially, what Remland is saying is that in order to reduce the disparity, the status, the feeling of being inferior, and essentially being ineffective in an organization, leaders must be aware of this, and they must be considerate in their behavior towards their subordinates. Then he moves on and says that managers need to become aware of the nonverbal communication messages conveyed by the subordinates in a face-to-face encounter. So there is also a need for superiors to pay close attention to the messages that their subordinates are exuding. And if need be, for example, if they're tense, the superior must behave accordingly so that the subordinate may no longer be tense and really drive the point across at the very end. For the most part in this article, I do agree that there is a need for nonverbal communication training. And what I liked a lot about this article is the fact that it is, what Remland is really talking about is essentially Christian. He conveys humility, respect, and consideration. Being humble, being a humble leader, really is what I'm trying to say, means that you must know that everyone is equal and that no one is superior over another, that we have all been created as equal and that we are equal in the eyes of God and therefore must act accordingly. Even though there are various roles, the only superior person is really Jesus Christ. We must also be respectful as superiors and be good listeners to our subordinates. And lastly, we must be considerate leaders. We must be able to develop our ability to encode and decode the nonverbal messages that our subordinates are telling us. And above all else, what I'd like to say is that we must first start an organization by eliminating the status, the name superior to subordinate, which is what I felt like the weakness of this article. Because when you give someone the title superior, then that gives me the feeling that it's a gateway to feeling that way and to being that way. So knowing and starting a company in equal playing field, and like I said, different roles, there are different roles, acknowledging that there are different roles, however, no one is superior than others, is the best way to actually eliminate the problems that we saw in the nonverbal communication field. That is essentially what the article talked about. And what I would like to end with is a quote from Micah, which says, this is actually Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly in God. May God bless you all, and thank you so much for paying attention.